This is me in 1981 in the plaid shirt. It's a month before my 8th birthday. A reporter from the local newspaper in Winston-Salem came to my 2nd grade class and asked us what we wanted to be when we grew up. My answer, a unit director at the children's home. I am quite sure that I didn't actually know what that very specific job title meant, but it's what my dad was doing at the time. And I loved the children's home, where he'd grown up as a resident and I was being raised like my mom had been as a staff kid. Whatever I was reaching for, my answer to that question was most likely some articulation of both admiring my father and valuing my community. I'd also clearly already internalized that this answer seemed to be more socially acceptable than my real dream at that point in my life, which was this. To be a solid gold dancer. For those of you under 50 who have no idea what that means, we have a clip. Okay, that's enough. What I want to know is why they're wearing harnesses, costumes designed by Tom of Finland. 6 of you got that joke, and I see you. I'll meet you later at the club. This is me in 1990. That's not me at 1990. But it's coming. I made things complicated. Sorry, Greg. So, this is me at 1990 in the plaid shirt. At age 16, a student on the high school yearbook staff asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up. And here's what you need to know about that kid. That Brian was idealistic, upbeat, hopeful, and terrified. They were thinking about teaching drama or English or entering the ministry. They knew they were good at a couple of things. They could stand up in front of a room and hold their attention. You can be the judge of the accuracy of that self-assessment. They had developed some leadership skills through scouting and church youth groups. They had a commitment to justice and advocacy, and they were very, very scared. As in, the often unable to eat up most of the night sweating and shaking kind of scared. Tightening the ties on the mask they wore until they dug into their skin out of fear it might slip and they'd be exposed scared. I'm not even sure that Brian was fully aware of all the layers of exposure they were afraid of, such as the plight of adolescence. Queerness was not the totality of that fear, but in the midst of what was being talked about as a gay plague, and as the far right looked for a new boogeyman in light of European communism's collapse, the volume was turned up on queerness to a near deafening intensity. Honestly, it can still sometimes be hard for me to look at pictures of that Brian. I hold them with a lot of grace and compassion. But because I remember the other side of that mask, I see straight through it. 34 years later, I find myself wanting to both warn them of what the next couple decades will hold and also tell them they'll get through it. But the metaphor of mask doesn't really hold up, or at least isn't reflective of the whole story. That Brian really was very often happy, playful, clever, and confident. It just wasn't all of who they were. And they'd not yet learned that the parts that were sad, angry, scared, and vulnerable could coexist with their outward persona. That Brian went on to do some pretty cool things, and this Brian is grateful for whatever gifts of resilience they accessed, which enabled them to survive. Though tracking my shifting professional ambitions through my adolescence through local publications is just one way to tell my story, and not the most important really, it is fair to say that I've had the opportunity to do some amazing work. And until the last 3 years, almost all of that work was focused on youth and young adults. I have had lots of time living into being the grown-up for other young people that my younger self so desperately needed. There's some themes that emerged along the way, 4 of which have been pretty constant in my academic and professional path: education, spirituality, gender studies, and vocation. As I say that out loud, I recognize how incredibly self-absorbed that journey could have been, might have been. I mean, I'm someone that lives with learning differences, for whom school was both my favorite place and simultaneously didn't feel like it was designed for me. Education. I was born into and still practice a spiritual tradition that for much of my life has been disproportionately focused on whether or not folks like me can legitimately participate. Spirituality. I became a student of gender informally before I even entered kindergarten because I received pretty constant, if contradictory and not entirely clear, messages that I was doing it wrong. Gender studies. And in no small part, as a result of those 3, I've never been quite sure what I was actually supposed to be doing with my life. Vocation. The routes that seemed most obvious and which I've pursued in tandem were exactly what 16-year-old Brian predicted, that of teacher and minister. And while I'm lucky to have found a path that included both, for that high school junior, the pursuit of either seemed dependent on my significantly editing or cutting off parts of myself, despite all the talk in each of those fields of showing up authentically and with passion. The dance, I like to dance. The dance between calling, what I was sure was mine to do, and call as in a job that would let me do it and actually pay the rent, was fraught with systemic exclusionary practices. Without justifying or celebrating bigoted oppression, from here at age 50, I can actually honestly see what a gift the ensuing dance has been. The experience of not quite fitting in my youth set me on a trajectory that has led me to ask a lot of questions. And those questions have been both constant companions and signposts on the journey. I've reframed them dozens of times, but they've never really left me. And particularly those questions about vocation, both what the word actually means and what mine actually might be. Continues to loom large for me. In fact, in the essay accompanying my PhD application, I wrote, I think perhaps at the heart of my vocation is vocation itself. Trying to understand the concept and accompanying others as they make sense of it in their lives. I penned those words 20 years ago, but they still largely ring true. In 1897, Paul Gauguin created a massive painting that he titled, Where Do We Come From? Who Are We? Where Are We Going? It's worth noting that while the title is usually presented with quotation marks, in the painting itself, Gauguin includes the words with no punctuation. They're up there in the corner. It's as if he's presenting the questions as declarative statements, less there to be answered than descriptions of what is. And in doing so, he seems to acknowledge they aren't quite answerable. There's a lot to be unpacked in this painting. Its 3 sections mirror the sort of triptychs of altarpieces, bringing it into conversation with a long history of Christian art. It centers women, specifically Tahitian women, and that can be read both as reorienting the subject of such lofty inquiry and simultaneously a product of an exoticized colonial gaze. Its style defies easy categorization. He's sort of a bridge between 19th century Impressionism and 20th century modernism. But for the purposes of our time together, tonight, it's the title itself that I'm most interested in. Where do we come from? Who are we? Where are we going? Gauguin borrowed these questions from his theology teacher. From ages 6 to 11, he was a student at a French seminary where he studied with a theologian and bishop by the name of Dupanloup. How did I do? French speakers, I've been very nervous about that word. I worked on Gauguin a whole long time too. So Dupanloup, who posed these questions as the framework, not just for all of theological inquiry, but as the drivers of all fields of study, which of course, in the history of Western thought, at some point, all have theological roots. Where do we come from? Who are we? Where are we going? So around the turn of this century, there was a lot of talk, a mild panic even, about the drop in enrollment in theological education. This was accompanied by a growing fear among some that the mainline church was dying. In response to that, the Lilly Foundation decided to divert part of the enormous profits, made in no small part to the massive sales in antidepressants, towards launching vocational discernment programs in colleges around the country. Yes, if you didn't know already, and many of you do, the support system for much of U.S. American church life comes directly from the makers of Prozac. They do lots of other stuff too, much of it really good work. In fact, I'd be shocked if there isn't at least one person here today that paid their way through a Lilly-funded clergy sabbatical grant. Is anybody here on a Lilly grant? Okay, how many of you have had a Lilly grant or participated in a Lilly-funded program? Yeah. Thank you, Auntie Lilly, for your continued financial support. I've been counting on you for about 25 years. Why these programs are significant, both culturally and for me personally, is that over the past couple of decades, they have led to a massive boom in the vocational discourse. Put that alongside other stuff like the work of educators Parker Palmer and Bell Hooks, and the growth in contemplative spirituality programs like what Richard Rohr and friends have done at the Living School. And we've got the emergence of a whole new popular spirituality of vocation that's making its way into the mainstream. I was part of one of those original Lilly grants that went to universities. While I was a student at Wake Forest Divinity School, I worked with some other folks to develop a program for high school students that might be considering vocational ministry. That was my first formal work on the subject, and this Venn diagram that I've used in dozens of contexts since, including with some of you, came out of that work. So the idea here is that if you're trying to figure out your vocation, then you might look at the intersection of where your passions, your gifts, and the world's needs intersect. It's based on a definition by Frederick Buechner. 25 years ago, with the exception perhaps of many Roman Catholic and some Quaker circles, vocation was largely associated either very specifically with the life and ministry, or that track in high schools that included shop classes and bricklaying. Growing up, I only ever heard it as code for those educational programs targeting students who weren't likely headed to college. To be fair, and I know some of you were a part of it, there were far broader conversations happening around vocation for decades before all of this, centuries even, with their late 20th century models, though often integrating tools from the personal growth and human potential movements of the 1970s and 80s. This is a very reductionist history, and I'm sure there's some of you thinking about all that I'm skipping over in it, while others of you are really ready for me to move on from the churchiness of this talk. And both are fair critiques. But the point is, as these rather significant grants were launched, staff and faculty started raising questions. The kind of work these programs were engaging, conversations about work and meaning and identity were resonating, but had much broader applications than just for students who might be approaching seminary. So Lilly broadened its reach, started funding initiatives around vocation at colleges across the nation. And thus, chaplains and directors of career centers joined efforts and wrote proposals. I was also one of those chaplains. And as I said, a lot of good has come and continues to come out of those grants. But perhaps their biggest shadow has been an underscoring of work, and more specifically, career, as a primary expression of one's identity. You can see how we understandably got there, but the idea has lots of problems and limitations. Built within it is an inherent classism. Not everyone gets to pay the bills by doing what they love. And all kinds of other things that folks might feel called to get pushed to the side, like partnership or parenting or neighborliness. I spent nearly 25 years working in those grant-funded programs focused on supporting folks as they sought to answer the question, what am I called to do? But I've come to realize the limitation of that framing. Perhaps it's because I landed in a mid-career crossroads at the beginning of a pandemic and spent a year walking up and down the same stretch of Irish shoreline wondering what my life was about. That's right down the hill from our apartment. It's really cool. And perhaps it's because I come to realize that the framing of the question had kept me too tied to a particular job. If my answer to what am I called to do was to be a teacher and a minister, then I kept finding myself stuck in roles that weren't quite fitting anymore, in institutions that I needed to move on from. But I was also somehow afraid that leaving would be a betrayal to, I don't know, myself, my community, God. But I realized I had long forgotten how to be in the world without my name tag. My work was way too tied to my identity, to my self-definition. So I shifted, and I started asking the question, who am I called to be? And as much as I loved that question, I spent too much time reading postmodern thought to stay comfortable very long with the idea of a singular, cohesive, coherent self that I was going to somehow find and rely on. I know that who I am is very much tied to culture and circumstance, time and place, and interpreting both my body and my experiences through the language accessible to me at any given point. And besides all that, I keep changing. Who I am is fluid. I'm a work in progress. So I shifted the focal question of my discernment again, this time to how am I called to be in the world? That gave me a little more wiggle room and escaped the potential traps I'd found in relying on a fixed identity. But it was missing a practical reality. It led me to a navel-gazing place, which worked okay for a while when we were on lockdown, but ultimately fell short of helping me figure out what was next. So a second part was necessary. What are the best containers through which I can live that out? How am I called to be in the world? And what are the best containers through which I can live that out? This reframing of the core question of vocational discernment also provided room for me to pay attention to the multiple and sometimes contradictory pulls on my life. Gareth, like most clergy spouses, will confirm that my work and home lives sometimes could fall out of balance. Turns out Gareth and I rather like each other, and my sense of call to my job had way too often become my central focus, and sometimes to the detriment of my sense of call to my marriage. So as a result, on one of those walks by Belfast Lock in 2021, when we'd been spending more time together than we ever had, and I'd been getting less anxious about what else wasn't getting done while we were doing it, Gareth said to me, "Whatever comes next, let's make sure it's at least as good as this." So that's the question I'm living with these days. How am I called to be? And what are the best containers through which I can live that out? And from there, I'm starting to develop practices and frameworks that are both more integrated and more sustainable. My work, my marriage, my friendships, my family, my organizational associations, I'm now thinking of as containers, not so much vocations in and of themselves, but sites through which my vocation can come more fully alive. This framing is allowing me to rethink my priorities and privilege the energy I give to which container. There's lots of approaches to this kind of growth journey, and lots of popular language being used to get at some of these ideas: balance, authenticity, wellness, thriving. Each of those and the discourses that grow around them has their strengths. But from where I'm standing, vocation is both unique and important. It offers us three particular lenses towards understanding ourselves in contexts that none of those others fully encapsulate. First, it requires grappling with existential premises. The root of the word vocation is vocare, Latin for to call. If we're working with the idea that we are called, we have to grapple with who or what is doing the calling. Are we called out of our gifts, out of our wounds, out of some inner voice, or even God, or however you talk about the sacred transcendent? Vocational discernment insists that while we're trying to make sense of our lives, we necessarily must consider what we believe about the nature of creation. To return to Gauguin, we must lean into where do we come from? Secondly, the work of vocational discernment requires some concept of the self. This can be tricky work because it exists on two layers. Most of the time we find ourselves in conversations about vocation when we say things like, I'm on a quest for self-understanding or self-awareness or self-knowledge. But I think there's a deeper invitation here that goes unexamined often. There's a nudge here to consider what the very idea of self means. Or if you want to take a more poetically religious approach, what we mean by the soul. Psychologists, biologists, sociologists, philosophers, artists, and poets all have something to contribute to this. And perhaps it is ultimately an unanswerable question. The discernment is to figure out a good enough, workable definition before getting lost down a rabbit hole of prolonged existential crisis and ending up with 3 graduate degrees, 20-some years of therapy, and undeniable qualifications for a 12-step program. I say that out of personal experience. Thankfully, the third unique aspect of vocation offers us a way through the potential for getting stuck down that aforementioned self-absorbed rabbit hole of navel-gazing. Vocation has inherently built into it a compulsion to engage with community. Now, this happens in 2 ways. The first is that any pondering of existential premises, where do we come from, and concept of self, who are we, worth its salt, leads us to ask, where are we going? Notice the pronoun choice here. It's we, not I. Vocation as a concept assumes what we might call a common good orientation. And while that's a messy notion, I mean, who gets to decide what's good for the collective us? It necessarily implies finding a way of being in relation to the rest of creation. It considers self-interest, but in concert with and perhaps in service to the interests of the whole. The discernment process then is about finding some way of being in both. And the second way community shows up here, as my friend Nancy Hastings Sehested, who's sitting in the back, reminded me after my breakout session at this gathering last year, is that vocation is confirmed in community. Perhaps the clearest and most ritualized form of that are the ordination processes for those of us called into vocational ministry. One names the sense that they might be called to that way of life, then seeks support for entering into some process of formation, and then upon completion, if they still feel like that call resonates, seeks a formal blessing from their faith community. When it works, it's a pretty amazing thing. However, there's a catch, and that sometimes the community has in mind a rather narrow image of what someone receiving a particular call is supposed to look like, and then withholds their blessing from those that don't meet its criteria. Our collective history is full of examples of artists and scientists and prophets who were ahead of their communities and met with rejection, many of whom didn't really get a communal confirmation of their call until long after they were gone. So there's a tension here, but I think it can be a productive one. The trailblazers among us often find themselves forming alternative communities or embracing the fact that part of living out their vocation includes issuing a loving, if painful, challenge to their home communities to grow and change. So what's all this have to do with storytelling? And particularly transformative storytelling, whatever that means. I'm paying attention these days to thinking of vocational stories as a genre, one in which our stories of the sacred, our stories of ourselves, and our stories of our community are uniquely woven together. What we at the Porch advocate for, which is to say, what Gareth and I talk about over the kitchen table and are humbled and amazed that we keep finding folks willing to show up and join with us, is that when we get down to the core of who we are called to be, we find this idea of transformative storytelling. At least for us, and we suspect for some of you, our highest calling, part of what Paulo Freire may have meant when he said our vocation is to be more fully human, is to be transformative storytellers. Maybe even more specifically, we're called to be holy editors and interpreters. What I mean by that is that we are called to think critically and carefully about the stories that have been handed to us, about God and the universe, about ourselves and about our communities. And in doing that, we are tasked with the work of both honoring the wisdom in those stories we've been handed and discerning what works and what needs to be reconsidered. But no storyteller operates in a vacuum. Whether in language or music or images, we are constantly working and reworking with the tools of our trade. We may develop significant competencies in one particular set of tools, but still recognize that other tools have value and merit, and that the folks who have mastered those tools may invite us into other ways of knowing that our tools cannot reach. And so storytelling is always a dialogical process. It's a conversation, even when one of us is given or claims the microphone. To be clear, this vocation of transformative storytelling takes on many guises. There are lots of containers through which we can live that out. So for example, Gareth and I share this work that we call the Porch. But even within that, we have different containers through which we live out our answers to how we are called to be. He primarily writes and literally tells stories, but he also carries much of the weight of initiating these convenings. I primarily work as a spiritual director, sitting attentively one-on-one with other folks in their own stories and asking questions intended to invite them to consider how the sacred is moving through those stories and inviting new interpretation. Gareth engages with movies. We watch a lot of movies as a way to think about the stories we tell. And I tend to look to ancient Middle Eastern literature as a basis for preaching. We join up our efforts from time to time and gather folk together, introduce them to our conversation partners and ask them to join in that conversation. But even the act of joining up our efforts is a story. We are rewriting a narrative of what marriage means, and also what it means, particularly as folks who don't have children, for a marriage to be procreative. It can be messy work. At times, we're juggling multiple Google documents and trying to remember just to be kind to one another as we're doing it. We do not always succeed. For years, we tried to articulate the thread that ran through all of our projects until one morning in January of 2023, when I emerged from our bedroom to find Gareth sitting at our dining table doing his usual start of the day routine that I'm not supposed to interrupt. He looked up at me and said something like, "I really just want to work with storytellers." And that led to a conversation that ended up with me getting out a flip chart and markers, because that's who I am, and mapping out all of our various efforts. Oh, we realized that's what we already do. We'd been trying to find some concise way to explain how movie events, storytelling nights, his writing projects, my spiritual direction, our Ireland retreats, the newsletter, and online magazine were all part of the same cloth. What we realized is that our shared call, this thing that we've named the Porch, is a web of attempts to engage folks who were understanding that at least part of their vocation was to tell better stories. We shifted our gaze, realizing that you all and all the other folk who engage with us in one way or another are not an audience, but a gathering of like-spirited folks who are each doing your part to tell a better story through counseling, legal practices, game design, marketing, IT support. I see you, Greg. Art, music, teaching, writing, being grandparents, being grandchildren, performing, witnessing, in 1,000 different ways. For those of you who have been along for this ride over the last decade or so, first off, thank you. You know, there's always been a sort of vibe to our events, even when they were really hard to describe. This wasn't actually that great a leap in reconsidering what we do. We've always known that the folks we are privileged to work with were more than simply an audience, but it was a clearer articulation of what was already happening. We had stumbled with varying degrees of intentionality into being the conveners of a community of folks who know that stories matter. And we're interested in thinking about how those stories function in co-creating a better world. Or showing up in the world as it is, with a better story of themselves. And so here at the Porch Gathering, we get a few days to highlight that collective call, to bring you, storytellers of all sorts, together and introduce you to some of our friends who are themselves reflecting on this idea of transformative storytelling, consciously engaging our narratives in a way that opens up possibilities rather than shutting them down and leaning into us versus them stories that separate, divide, and evoke fear. We believe our community needs this. We believe our country needs this. We believe it's good for the world. To be fair, all stories are transformative. All narratives shape the way we interpret our bodies, identities, culture, social order. But when we use the phrase transformative storytelling, we're specifically talking about a call to bring to the surface engaged stories that promote connection, claim the strength of vulnerability, and embody what Richard Rohr is talking about when he says the best criticism of the bad is the practice of the better. Not all of us lead with writing and performing as the primary container through which we live out the call of storytelling. You've heard Gareth talk and you've heard me talk. It's really more his thing. But we are all telling and living in stories that shape our experience and the experiences of those around us. It's a unique capacity of humanity. So we get to decide how conscious we're going to be of that and what we're going to do with it. That's the invitation. Many of you heard me say before that we chose the name The Porch in tribute to the farmhouse culture from which I come. This is the front porch of my great-grandparents' house in Iredell County, North Carolina. It's where my parents now live. This is my granddaddy leaning up against the porch post. And that's his twin brother, and Frank, who is my cousin and uncle, my uncle cousin. It's a small community. This is Granddaddy, his twin brother Marshall, and Frank about 60 years later on that same porch. We still gather on that porch, where time seems to move a little slower. Stories have room to breathe. Neighbors stop by to check on the elders and give updates on friends and family we have in common. It's the original social networking. As has happened since I was a child, when those neighborly updates come, someone invariably reminds me of exactly how I'm kin to the person they're talking about. Though I've never actually physically resided in that community, the constant message delivered to me on that porch is, you are one of us. You belong here. Our stories are your stories, and your stories are ours. May you experience a bit of that in these next few days. Thanks for joining us on the porch. You all are welcome here, and all of you is welcome here.